I'm really interested in is the distinction that is sometimes made between myth versus mythology.
Mm.
With this idea, and this is again, it's a kind of a pedantic distinction, but maybe useful for the conversation that we're going to have today. And that is, there's some people who make a distinction between myth and mythology, where myth is a participatory story, right?
Mhm.
It's a story that people continue to participate in. And so maybe it's a story that sort of explains how we came together as a people, or it explains something about the world, but it's a story that we continue to participate in. And so because of that, it's got a deep resonance, especially for people whose lives have been shaped by it. And then mythology is what you're left with once the participation stops.
The
Um,
artifact.
right, it's sort of the artifact of the myth. So you could say the myth is the living thing, and then mythology is what is left over when it stops being alive. It's the bones, it's the skeleton, it's the fossil. Still very interesting and evocative to study, because your imagination kind of fills in the gaps and says, well, what if this thing was alive? What would that be like?
Mhm.
But anyway, so I'm not going to insist upon that distinction, but I do think that it's important to bring into this conversation, only because participation is the big this is the big thing, right, that we have to sort of figure out, especially as like middle class myth makers, right? um there are different levels of participating in stories. One is reading them, or watching them, or consuming them, but there are other methods of participation as well. Ultimately, if you don't have people participating in your story on some level, then it's dead. Even if you like it, it's very pretty, but if there's no participation to the extent that to the extent that it doesn't have participation, it's dead. And so, I mean, I'm very interested in superhero stories for a lot of different reasons. But one of the reasons that I'm interested in superhero stories is that they have a level of participation which is really unlike anything else. And when I say this, I mean that people who people who would never wear. I see that Neil is wearing a cross. I have the same cross. It's on my nightstand right now, and so I recognized it when I saw you wearing it. I'm not wearing that one today. I'm wearing this medal which has the Theotokos on one side and Saint Seraphim of Sarov on the other side. But uh, people who would never wear a cross will wear like a pendant or a bracelet with the Superman, the S shield on it, right? I have multiple T-shirts with the Superman S shield on it, and I put them on and I wear them, and it's the participation, like when participation is real when it's like to the level of being something that's totally subconscious, totally unconscious. I don't think about that shirt when I put it on. I just put it on because I like it. I like Superman. Um, so there's a really unique level of participation in our culture in superhero stories. And I mean, this is one of the things I think it'll outlive even, say, Marvel fatigue or whatever the industry is
Oh, for
going through
sure.
right now. So
Hmm.
okay, I talked way too much. It's a little rambly, but I think that participation is an important element in the way that we should be thinking about storytelling.
No, I think you made a really good distinction there with that. I think too, because there are modern myths that people are participating in. And so I think one of the things, like when we look back at Greek mythology, we can see that there was a participation, even though we're not involved in that participation, there was something about that participation that was aiming too low, meaning that offering worship to, like, say, Aphrodite, or sacrifice to her so you can get the right girl, would be aiming too low. Right. So there's this other bad association with mythology where people think about, worshiping not the highest thing, like from a religious perspective. So there's that distinction. But at the same time, like, of course, those type of myths, those need to go to the wayside. But I think that there's a way you can use the word. The word is non-dual in that sense, that it depends on how you're using it, what are you using it for. If you're trying to distract people from a truth to your political side or whatever it is, however people tell stories now, would be a bad example of that. But if your myth, and in your myth making, you're condensing and expanding aspects of reality so they can be seen more clearly, interacted with, understood.
There's also one thing I would add to all that we're saying here, because the word myth is becoming synonymized in this conversation with story, and
Mhm.
which is not necessarily incorrect. But there's something that I heard Martin Shaw say recently, and that's he was having a conversation with Malcolm Geit, and they were talking about, you know, the kinds of stories that tend to last the longest. And Martin Shaw is a mythologist and a myth teller, both, which is a rare thing for a person to be both the teller of the story and the analyzer of the story. It's very difficult to hold those two poles together and not go insane. He does it very well. And his point is that myth is a product of an oral tradition. It's a story that's told. And so it takes a much longer time for that kind of story to be told well, because it keeps getting told over and over again from generation to generation. It requires a rooted culture in a place. It requires a long time. And so all the stuff that Neil's talking about, the commodification of stories and the everything that we're seeing, so the death of the author, the sort of decomposition of good storytelling styles, all of that is largely a product not just of money, but also of a literary culture, of a culture of things written down. And the internet is making that worse, because it's written culture writ large and very fast. So it's not good for preservation. It's good for deconstruction. It's good for breaking things down to its absolute constituent part and as fast as you can. It's not good for cultivating the kind of oral tradition that will give rise to a new kind of myth. So in all that we talk about, this is really what I think we would love to see happen more of, is that.
So
Richard's about to explode.
I just got super excited when you mentioned oral storytelling and oral culture. So you remember a minute ago when I mentioned, you know, like everybody who reads the hero's journey for the first time, like you could, like it's this cosmic shift, you know, and it takes them a little while to actually sort of grow out of it so they can actually go back and appreciate it for what it actually is. So for me, the book was not Hero's Journey. The book was Albert Lohr's The Singer of Tales, which is a very imperfect book by, let's say, standards of modern scholarship. But if you want to understand the way that stories emerge through oral storytelling culture, I mean, this is the book to read. You know, one of the things that makes a myth is that it's repeatable. You can repeat it in a different context, right? This is why Shakespeare's plays have the ability to kind of transcend just being a play about it, like a specific period in Italy. You can take The Merchant of Venice or Much Ado About Nothing, and you could set it in a modern setting, and you'd be able to tell the story, and it would be still recognizably Shakespeare, right? So there's a kind of a mythic quality to those things, even though those stories aren't, properly speaking, myths. As you see the disintegration of like the big centralized story, right? One of the biggest things you can do, one of the most important things you can do is kind of loop all the way back around and try to get back to that, the clan gathering around the fire at night and telling a story together, right? And telling the same story that you told last week, the same story that you told last year, right? If a story can't be retold, it's not a good story. So recently I did this event where we got together when I was in Wichita back in October. We got together and we just read English ghost stories, like old English ghost stories, around a bonfire.
That's awesome.
For about 3 hours.
Wow.
You know, and some of the ghost stories were like original, you know, 17th, 18th century ghost stories. But one of them was an original story. And it was an original story that was due to be published in an anthology soon. So the guy who'd written it wanted to read it to us to see what we thought. And it was a great story, very spooky, very evocative, kind of a twisty ending. I really loved it. Build a mythos within your little community, 2, 3 people, 4 people. Start there.